So customers expect leaders to take a stand, and this is one of the notes that I was most surprised about, but also very excited about in the Edelman study. 46% of consumers that they surveyed believe that brands have better ideas for solving our country's problems than government. It's really sad. It's really sad, but true. And 53%, this is perception, of course, but 53% of brands are really feeling like they can do, or people feel like they can do more. I'm a huge fan of WGBH, and my very first job in production was as a PA at WNET, so public television fan from day one. But I think, what's interesting today is if we think about sort of the role that branded content has played over the years, I think that this is a very apt illustration. And really, while it's evolved tremendously, I think for those of you who might have heard the earlier panel, I think there's just still a lot of challenges with sort of getting big, creative projects off the ground. So one of the things I just wanted to quickly touch on is this whole idea of brands who are making movies. And it's becoming sort of an increasingly popular trend. There's a huge number of the world's largest brands globally who are sponsoring documentaries. And they're really sort of staying out of the way of creatives. I think that's a hard thing to do given the sort of evolution that the media industry has taken over the last 5 to 10 years. But I wanted to just quickly touch on sort of what we see as the underpinnings of cultural, technological, and strategic value trends that are leading towards this movement. And specifically, there's like 8 trends. There's new research on this all the time. Edelman actually just released a report, which I've borrowed heavily from in this presentation with their sort of earned brands thing, but I'll just take this super quick. One of the things that I think is I've been speaking about for the last couple of years, and it's still very controversial, but brands who are leading right now are taking a stand. And I think, that's sort of the opposite of where brands and executives, and specifically like CMOs that we work with, have, sort of grown up in this world where you never talk about politics, you never talk about religion, right? It's a business environment. And increasingly, while it is controversial, what we're seeing is that there's this whole arrival of the belief-driven buyer that's leading to more and more brands really needing to have a point of view. I'm sure we'll talk about specific examples that Brian and I know and love. But increasingly, there's also this movement towards transparency, obviously with the proliferation of information, real and fake, through social channels. It becomes really important that brands take responsibility and that ethics are, sort of first and foremost in their own behavior as well as in their storytelling. Ad blockers are increasingly on the rise. If you are trying to reach anybody in India or China, you pretty much can't do it through advertising on a mobile device. And in the US, it's one of the most popular apps is an ad blocker. So rather than produce content involving millions of dollars, right, in traditional advertising that people are trying to avoid, we try to make the argument that, telling stories is the way to go if you're doing it strategically. And then there's ad-supported media, which is sadly, as a lover of ad-supported media, is really in decline. I think historically, the Wall Street Journal has been tracking a lot of this, but others have as well, of generationally, there's not only just the cord cutters, as the last panel talked about, but also the cord nevers of people who just really have zero tolerance for ads. And then you're also seeing just this overwhelming clutter on social channels. So if you can't reach people through television and traditional ads, it's also equally challenging, if not more so, to really penetrate what is, an increasingly cluttered environment on social channels. And then people, obviously love brands. They're willing to be associated with brands on a regular basis. And not only are brands being called to take a stand, but also customers expect leaders to take a stand. And this is one of the notes that I was most surprised about, but also very excited about in the Edelman study. 46% of consumers that they surveyed believe that brands have better ideas for solving our country's problems than government. It's really sad. It's really sad, but true. And 53%, this is perception, of course, but 53% of brands are really feeling like they can do, or people feel like they can do more than government. So I think there's this whole belief that, as has been demonstrated in recent executive, who are courageous, that they're in a position to affect the culture much more readily than sort of our elected leaders. And finally, this is the 8th trend, and then I'll stop rambling. Belief-driven buying is now mainstream. And I think what's interesting is in 2017, it was sort of discovered that people were voting with their wallets. But this year, what we found is that not only are all income levels now demonstrating this behavior, but additionally, every generation believes this too. So it's not just people, the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, kind of going out on the social channels and ranting. It's actually a massive movement globally across all classes and throughout all age groups. And with that, I will turn it over to Brian and Rob.
Okay. I want to talk about a little bit about the same kind of trends, and then give a case study of a brand that I do work with, and show where things are kind of going in this space. If I can get my slides up real quick. So my company, it's called Subgenre. It's a very small company, me and just a few staff. And most of my work in the last few years has been working with brands that are moving into this space. And it's happening a lot. New clicker. So right now I've been working with Patagonia, with REI, with brands like Yeti coolers. How many people know Yeti coolers? Okay, they're getting pretty popular up here. They used to be just big in redneck communities, but it's getting elsewhere now too. But they took their entire $8 million Super Bowl ad budget and said, screw it, we're not gonna make a Super Bowl ad, we're gonna make films. And so that's what's going on in this space. And so why are people doing this? And Megan just gave us 8 great examples of why. But I think the most important thing, and it's underlying what you were just talking about, is this great paradigm shift that digital has caused that's completely realigned the notion of value. In the old world, in the film world especially, everything was built around the idea of scarcity. It was really hard to make films. It was expensive to make films. You had to go to film school. We shipped them around in film cans. There were, only so many channels, so many shows, and now we live in a world of superabundance. And in a world of superabundance, we have an attention economy, and what matters now is my time more than ever. And I've got a million options of where to watch things, and that was talked about in the last panel as well. And so what matters now is that you engage me, because I get bored really fast. And in addition to that, you're seeing this rise of SVOD, particularly Netflix, but also Amazon Prime, et cetera, where they're spending tons of money making content and there's no ads. And so the only way to break through for a lot of these companies and even get your attention and have you even have a sense of knowing who they are is to make good content that you will want to watch. And everyone's doing it. As I mentioned before, Yeti, a cooler company that you store your beer in, is making documentaries now. This is a recent example where Kotex is now making it started with a series about vampires, including an episode about do vampires get their periods. It was so popular that it became a movie called Carmilla, and they're now making a second movie based on it because there's so many millions of fans who are in love with this series and now film. So literally, if you can think of a brand, they are making films. This is a recent example that I think you mentioned in your slides as well. NetScout made this film called Lo and Behold. They got Werner Herzog to do it. That's a brave brand to hire Werner Herzog to do your film for you. And I'm gonna give a quick case study, and I'm gonna run through these slides really fast. This is Patagonia, one of my clients. And this film is a few years old now, but it's a great case study of what a brand can do. So Damnation is a film that's about dam removal, which I knew nothing about when they came to me, and a lot of people don't know anything about it, but dams are not actually green power. They all have a shelf life and get clogged up and have to get blown up eventually. And people are starting to do that around the world, and Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, wants people to blow up dams and get rid of them because he's a fly fisherman and he cares about salmon. So they hired a couple independent filmmakers, gave them complete creative control, and made this film called Damnation, which premiered at South by Southwest, and then in theaters, and then on Netflix and iTunes and everywhere else. Eventually also made it onto Nat Geo for a second window. But these are examples of what a brand can bring to a campaign in terms of marketing support. And with this film, it was all about making a difference. So it was about crack down on deadbeat dams. Those are dams that are dead and not producing power. And we did a petition to Obama. This was back during the Obama administration, specifically focused on the lower Snake River dams, which are slated to go. But we were able to support the film in myriad ways. So I didn't say this in public, but this graffiti down the side of a dam was paid for by a brand. I won't say who it was, but they might have been involved in this film. And we took the film on tour to every Patagonia store. We turned the windows of the stores at Patagonia into billboards for the film. So when it came out, every Patagonia store in America was promoting this little documentary. We were able to do things like get Yvonne Chouinard to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times. When you went into a store, every image you saw hanging from the ceiling was related to the film. So not only can a brand help make a film, but they can bring the marketing power to get a little film that I would normally make as an independent filmmaker. They can get it into their stores and get millions of people to see it. We made merchandise like these hats and t-shirts. I didn't realize this. Rob pointed out to me in a recent panel that these hats are now going for like $400 on eBay because they didn't make enough of them and people liked them so much. And we did a tour of the film to every Patagonia store and played it. We did screenings in conjunction with nonprofits. We did homepage takeovers of the entire Patagonia webpage. We would do Instagram contests to get people's attention on the issue, and essentially used every single aspect. The catalog, for example, 850,000 homes, had an insert about the movie. And the idea was to use every single aspect of the brand to push people to see this film and then sign petitions to Obama. And it worked. So we ended up having great festival success. We've now played the film, I think it might be a record, but I have no proof, in over 600 film festivals around the world. We've done over 300 campus screenings. It was picked up for SVOD and for broadcast as well. And most importantly, they spent roughly about $500,000 making the film and about another $500,000 in cash on hard expenses for marketing. So about $1 million, but they got about $4.6 million in earned media as a result of this. So it works, it gets lots of attention, 625 million free media impressions. It's the kind of stuff that makes brands continue to do this, which they do. This is a recent film we did. This is an outdoor screening we did with thousands of people showing up outside a Patagonia store to watch the movie. We just did this movie in Europe to crack down on dams, and the Balkans are the only rivers that are not dammed in Europe, and there's proposals now to dam them, and so we're trying to stop that. So the battle continues. And going back to your point, Patagonia is also very activist as a company, so they did this when Trump took over Bears Ears, and they're continuing to be activists through films. And I think you'll see that a lot more through multiple brands. I'm now working with REI, and we'll talk about this during the panel, but they're also moving into narrative films, not just documentary. So I think you're gonna see this space is just growing and exploding. And so Rob's gonna come up and give us a few more examples, and then we'll have a conversation about it.
Yeah, so the company I work for called 0.0, we're best known for Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, The Mind of a Chef, Meat Eater, done the feature docs, The Last Magnificent, along with Wasted, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. The example I'm going to queue up now is a film called Fermented that we released at the Seattle International Film Festival last year, and it was completely funded by a brand called Volpe Foods. They were one of the oldest sommeliers in the United States, and they were launching the consumer-facing piece of their business. They had traditionally done like a lot of like private label salami, prosciutto, and things like that for like Boar's Head and things, and they wanted to start to sell directly to consumers. And so we came up with a strategy where they were going to become a thought leader in the fermentation space, and they're surprisingly had never been a documentary about the history of fermentation. So we collaborated with Chef Ed Lee to film this documentary called Fermented.
A dog is not man's best friend. Our best friends are the microbes that surround us. The millions and millions and millions of tiny invisible bacteria that want us to survive because we help them to expand and grow and multiply, and they help us eat and digest and transform. And it's a magical relationship. We're both here to help each other. Why not start cultivating a relationship with them?
People project this generalized fear of bacteria onto fermentation, and they imagine that chopping up vegetables, salting them, and putting them in a jar is playing Russian roulette. The fermentation actually is a strategy for food safety.
I think fermentation adds a complexity on a dish. Perhaps someone can eat something and remember something that might not be that dish, but memory. It triggers memory.
What is fermentation? I think fermentation is, for me, at the base and core of everything that I want to eat.
Sourdough is just flour, water, salt. Fermentation is the magic to the whole thing.
It exists in every kitchen around this world. From whatever culture you come from whatever ethnic background, there is a tradition of fermentation.
For anyone who's got an ounce of romanticism in their body, I can see how alluring it would be. I can see how seductive it is to spend an entire life just being enwrapped in this process and doing it again and again, because every single time you see this transformation happen, it does raise questions. It does pique curiosity. It does make you more part of this process of nature happening. It's somewhat encouraging in that all of us can just start on that path. The bacteria is around us. We just have to reach out and touch it. And when we do, they will perform. One thing that I want people to come away with is that fermentation is not a cooking technique. It's a livelihood, it's a tradition, it's a relationship with the world around us.
The film's been screened at over 150 food festivals, and then will be released through TVOD and SVOD in 2019. I think the brands really felt like they got a lot of value out of it as being kind of their entry point into those communities and being seen as a first mover and influencer in this space. We published an accompanied print publication called Cured With It. So yeah, I think that's a good example of a brand funding something that's a bit of an aspirational piece.
So I wanted to ask both of you the question that always comes up when I talk to people about brands and film is creative control. What's been your experience on the range of how brands work with filmmakers and production companies and how much control they want or not or don't?
Start. I think that's a great question. I feel like it's evolved over time. I think that this is going to sound ageist, and I really don't mean it, but I feel like as the executives that we work with are more sort of digital natives and understand the way in which social channels work, that they become less proprietary and less treating digital and sort of multi-platform or omni-channel content as they would a TV spot where sort of the Don Draper era, the brand is like the most senior person, only slightly superior to the creative director at the agency, but there's always these warring feuds between, sort of an idealistic artistic project and sort of a brand message or, sort of corporate character. And I think today's world is a lot more collaborative. I think that people understand that, and at least the best brands do, and the most innovative executives, that they may not have all the ideas, and that putting their product at the center of something is going to really be a turnoff. And that making the story itself a really well-crafted, beautiful experience will ultimately serve their business objective better.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the conversations come down to like, what are your expectations on distribution? And if you just want to have an infomercial, you don't need to spend money at a production company like us or like Magnet. You can go do that with your nephew and his iPhone. I think we usually reserve like final edit control and things like that around the project, and a lot of that is also to maintain like editorial status versus commercial, to lower costs on music or talent releases and all kind of the back office stuff. I obviously there's trust in any project, and especially on documentaries where budgets are a bit larger, like we'll have clauses in the contract that say we're not going to disparage their brand or different things like that, but a lot of it comes down to trust, and the brand partner knows we're not going to create something that is going to embarrass them or do anything that's harmful to their brand equity.
Yeah, in my experience, most of the brands I work with are giving the filmmakers complete creative control and final cut, and that also helps with later on getting it into film festivals and having the audiences take it seriously because they can tell it's a genuine product that was made by a good team. But I've seen examples, like I was recently working with a brand that will remain unnamed on a film project where they did give the filmmakers complete creative control, but then the filmmakers took that so seriously that they just disappeared and weren't keeping the brand informed, and so that kind of blew up because then the brand was like, well, we need to know what's going on. I mean, this is going to come out eventually. So it's a little bit of a balance, but
yeah, I think over the years we've certainly learned that, like even before you get into the pre-production phase, it's meeting with their executive team or whoever are stakeholders on the project, understanding their goals before you even start out is like incredibly important. Outlining all of what the deliverables are going to be so they're very clear, and we get a lot of most of our business is inbound, and it's we want to have a show on Netflix, and like you kind of spend the first minute, hey, it's not YouTube, you just don't upload it to something and it's on there, but it's a process. But I think brands are becoming a lot more savvy, and I think if you look at like they've obviously seen the success of a brand like Patagonia and what they've done in investing in very high quality feature-length documentaries that have, a political point of view. You can't be scared to offend a portion of your potential, customer base and things like that. And it really pays off, I think, if you're, willing to, kind of jump off the cliff.
what's been some of your best examples of clients you've worked with where it's really gone well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the longer the relationship, the better the greater the trust and the sort of better the collaboration. So, I mean, we've worked with TIAA for nearly a decade, and I think that they've, again, evolved as the company has grown and changed. And most recently, we hired, or I should say, brought on board to our team 3 sort of Sundance Jury Award-winning filmmakers to make short-form pieces, but that were like 10 minutes each, and those were it's part of a Difference Maker series. You can Google it, and it's those films are just stunning, and they really did have a lot of latitude to go to Mexico or Puerto Rico, whoever they needed to be in order to capture the stories authentically. So that was one. I think that some of the work that we've collaborated on with Google has been really inspiring, and
What kind of stuff?
That's been like a decade-long relationship. So there's a couple hundred different projects, but in 13 countries and stuff. So I think that the 2 things I'll say about working with Google, I know it's a tough week to be supporting them as a brand, but I do think that they are really self-aware in many cases, and eager to invite to the table those that they need to in order to tell a great story. So that's been one thing that I've noticed. I feel very supported as a women-owned business owner by our relationship, and I think that the creativity is shocking in Silicon Valley, and I think that they're very confident when it comes to their analytics and their knowledge of obviously algorithms and ability to scale content, but they are, in my experience, extremely humble when it comes to what makes a great story, and they would rather sort of work with a collaborator who's known for that. That's why I think a lot of the partners are on the East Coast, frankly. The design, the craftsmanship, the storytelling, the history is so much more, is deeper here.
Rob?
I think, over the years, like some of the most interesting brands we've worked with were people who were trying to reach like an underutilized audience, like for example, Meat Eater. And so Meat Eater was a hunting show that we started 6 years ago with an author named Stephen Ranella. And typically hunting shows, I'm assuming there's not a lot of Sportsman Channel or Outdoor Channel watchers in the crowd. Like they're kind of like these very...
How many of you watch Sportsman Channel or Outdoor Channel? Only 2 or 3
Yeah, so
people?
if you've seen them, like they were very kind of like infomercial-ly, like you've got the Chevy truck integration, you've got the shotgun, you've got the camo pattern, the guys are calling them out, and like very low production value. So we kind of took the approach of, filming it the same way we'd film an episode of Parts Unknown. There was light integration, just if you saw like the logo of the jacket he was wearing or whatever like that, and it really took off and became kind of like a 360 media platform. We had a website, podcast, all sorts of a lot of digital content and things like that, and partnering with those brands, and like Yeti was one of them, First Light, several others, saying, hey, you don't need to just focus on making sure you've got 15 logo impressions per 22-minute episode and things like that. But also talking about, like Steve is a very unique guy in the hunting space as well, where he's a conservationist first, so talking about those issues and bringing them to light. I think that was a very interesting kind of project, and it's now the first hunting show that's a Netflix original with the new season that just came out in October.
And you have a film based on it at Doc
Yeah,
NYC?
yeah, with Doc NYC. So if you're in New York, November 2nd, it's called Stars in the Sky, and it's the history of hunting in the United States especially, but talks about kind of the conservationist background of that, and everything that has kind of led up to the current conversation around hunting, and things like big game hunting in Africa, and like a lot of the social conversations. And I think like what you really learn is it's pretty easy to get caught in kind of your your bubble of being a production company based in New York or based on the East Coast or based in LA, and seeing what audiences kind of across the country are interested in, and coming up with stuff that doesn't like dumb it down, and it doesn't underestimate the audience, and kind of setting a bar for what those sorts of things can be.
That's great. Do
Yeah,
you mind if I just interject one other note? Because I think you're totally right about that. And I think, provoking a conversation, as I was like alluding to, is like, again, it's still a brand new idea.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make it seem like it's like super mainstream, and like Madison Avenue is like turning over all of their, hundreds of millions of dollars to filmmakers. Sadly, that's not happening quite yet. But I do think that, these trends are inevitable, and they're only going the direction of like more and more sort of creative, well-crafted content. And one quick example I just came too late was that Rent the Runway, which is obviously a very fast-growing startup that's raised unicorn-level money, and Jennifer Hyman's amazing CEO, who's just a fabulous female founder, and she sort of was way ahead of sort of the Me Too trend and starting a nonprofit as part of her organization and part of like the values that they had committed to other female founders. So they started a 501c3 called Project Entrepreneur, and UBS was actually a sponsor of it, and it was a live experience starting to really support female business owners throughout the country through these incubators. and just incredible content, really great, sort of like raw, unvarnished, unfiltered conversations about starting and running a company. And then they brought us on to actually design not only documentary pieces, but also podcasts that were sort of enabling it to scale digitally. And I think that's the other thing to think through on the sort of content creation side, is like what partners really belong at this table, like what would make sense for this conversation to be true, because there's projects that I'm sure you're in the same place that we're not the best to tell it, and we would be happy to refer it to somebody else kind of thing, but that we get called upon because of whatever. You have your relationship with Netflix, obviously, which is amazing. We have experience in Facebook and YouTube, and people think like, oh, I'll just call Magnet and like voila, we'll be viral, and it's instead, I think it you need to think through kind of what parties belong at that table to tell that story effectively.
Yeah. And how many of them are just saying, get me on Netflix? Like that seems like a common hope.
I think it's just like education on the brand side about how all these platforms work, and I think just them knowing that it has to be something that like Netflix, that's I think changing with like people that they're hiring and branded division popping up and stuff, but it has to be something that the audience is going to engage with on their own terms. There's no buying views on like a YouTube or anything like that. So it's got to live up to the audience expectations of being produced at a level that they're going to engage with on their own. And I think that's where, just as more people's eyes are opened around like the different social platforms and things like that, saying, all right, as a brand, I need to add value to the conversation to get people to engage and opt in. And, value can be a coupon if you're like a consumer packaged good company, but if you're someone like Patagonia, it can be a documentary film to create that ongoing conversation with the audience. And I think we're going to see more and more that as, they want to have access to first-party data, touching the audience directly. The platforms are becoming more close to any kind of sharing of data because of all the things that have happened for very good reason. To give a GBH plug, if you haven't watched The Frontline on Facebook, luckily they're not a client of mine, but I suggest you take 2 hours and watch it. It will be time well spent. So I think brands are certainly going to be looking for ways to connect with the audience directly more and more.
Yeah, the data part's kind of interesting. Like at REI, they have a lot of data on their consumers and know a lot of detail, but we made a decision early on not to use data to drive the content we're making. Instead, we're just going to creatives and letting them, we're giving them broad scope of it's an outside company, it's an outdoors company, but letting the creatives come up with good projects. But then we can use the data very precisely when we're marketing the films and make sure it gets to the right people.
Yeah, no, and I think sometimes like if you're a filmmaker or something, like don't be intimidated by hearing like, oh, we're gonna have to have data. Like, if you read a lot about like the direct-to-consumer brands that are building their businesses on Shopify, it really is the same thing is happening where the tools for market research have gotten so good, even things like SurveyMonkey. And if you have ways to connect with the audience directly, creating like these short surveys that ask them questions and getting them to opt in to sharing information, that can be very valuable for brands. And just helping them get that set up, especially like smaller and medium-sized businesses, or if it's a brand that's just launching. It's not like you need to have a 20-person analytics team that have PhDs from MIT or something to have data.
It's worse if you have them, actually.
Yes, because you don't know what the hell they're talking about. At least I don't. But
conflicting reports all day.
My experience has been the brands want to know, is there an audience for this, and can you just give me some data that proves that these people exist? If it's a niche audience in particular, how many millions is it? What do they consume? But also, they want to know, is it going to get seen? And so knowing you've got some kind of distribution partner in place that has some kind of audience. But I wanted to use that as a way to ask you both, for the filmmakers and producers and production companies in the audience that are interested in this area, you both have companies that are established and have been doing this for a while, and so people are just coming to you now, asking you to do things you don't even want to do. But how do you get started in this area? What's a good way to think about breaking into working in branded content?
I think that I like the idea of working with a direct-to-consumer brand because I think that any brand is going to be impressed by somebody's metrics. At the end of the day, the craftsmanship is key for sure, but I think that that's sort of table stakes in some ways, that there's 10,000 production companies in this country right now, and so if you're only producing content, I think that's not seen as a differentiator. Sorry to be, sort of throw cold water onto it, but that alone is going to be tough to pitch a brand. If you can do something with a company that you have access to, like a fast-growing, owner-owned or employee-owned brand where there's not a lot of bureaucracy, and pitch them and then produce something, maybe get like a social media expert if you're not familiar with that to demonstrate success, then I think taking that as a case study into any major ad agency. I know Keith was saying earlier he wants to meet with creators and things like that from time to time. We meet with people who have worked independently before, and I think that that's a great route to getting to the bigger brands.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just like keep doing the work and don't be scared to start small if you're just an independent 1 or 2 person shop, and take on those maybe less glamorous jobs, but use that to build your role and resume and reel and everything like that. And I mean, it's not anything that you don't know, but it's just keep at it and keep going, and you'll get the bigger and bigger jobs. Like, not everything is going to be a documentary that premieres at Sundance and is picked up as a Netflix original. It's just not the world that we live in. So.
Yeah, and I'll also say you can make a great living without necessarily having Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 brands on your reel. Like, it's definitely, there's a lot of money being spent on this arena, and and there's a lot of sort of domain expertise that's required in different areas. Like, for example, again, we don't really touch the beauty space at all because it's so well established already within that world of influencers and refinery. There's a lot of places that are really outstanding style hall at reaching the beauty consumer. So find an area where maybe you have a passion or an expertise, or of an expert, and I think kind of understanding that community is really is a great differentiator in addition to having great production skills. Yeah,
and I think too, a lot of the small, medium-sized brands look for people who can do a lot with a smaller budget, and even if it's not your core competency, if you can shoot, if you can edit, and then even take on a little bit of audience development and understanding, try to understand as many aspects of the business as you can. And some of it's to fake it till you make it. If you say, all right, yeah, we're going to do audience development, you'll get that going after you get the project shot and ready to go.
Yeah. At Patagonia, REI, Keen, and Yeti, 4 brands I've worked with, each of them have done projects with cold call filmmakers, where
That's
literally
amazing.
The filmmakers just had a great project. They didn't go all the way to the CMO, the top person. They found the person who was in charge of content, or the person who was in charge of skiing for that brand, because each brand has its own verticals, and they're usually less busy than the chief marketing officer.
Yes.
So they'll actually sometimes read their email and actually respond. But it does happen every now and then. It just comes in out of the blue. But it's rare. It's a lot of times we're discovering filmmakers from Sundance and then asking them what would they do for us.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you both, and we'll open up to the audience for questions in just a second here. But in my world, last week I was out in LA with REI, and we were meeting with lots of production companies, and they all started pitching us rock climbing movies and things they thought would be REI, and we told them all just to stop. We don't want any of those movies. We're actually looking for narrative films where maybe the outdoors only comes in briefly, like someone goes to a park and it helps them connect with nature and clear their mind. Like something that simple could be a film that REI would sponsor, which is like a whole new direction when a brand's thinking that way. And I wanted to ask you both kind of new trends you see, or where you think the future of where this is going.
Yeah, so we actually do, because there's so many things that are changing, we actually do an annual State of the Story report that involves a lot of original research and conversations with leaders in the space. Some of our competition we interview or CMOs that we haven't even worked with before, just to get some fresh thinking, because there's so many different people that are doing talented people that are doing different innovative things. And I'll tell you, just off the top of my head, I can tell you influencer marketing is not going away. It's massively successful for a lot of people, and largely because it's viewed by the brand as simpler, because influencers have a built-in audience and a fan base, and you could sort of like, what you're getting when you go and step into that community. It does not mean that it's sort of, I think a lot of people from a filmmaking background, myself included, initially thought of it as like user-generated content. That's not what influencer marketing is. If it's done well, it's much more sort of nuanced around like sort of what a social platform like Instagram, for example, rewards. So that's one area that we're seeing a lot of. And we actually partnered recently with a number of comedic influencers on Instagram. We're going to be releasing a new series this fall, which I'm really excited about. So that's one thing.
Rob?
Yeah, and I mean, you've both touched on it on your decks and things, but like a lot of social responsibility and diversity for, very good reasons. And I think just expanding the stories that are being told outside of like the bubble that we all kind of worked in or have worked in. And, I think brands are becoming a lot less afraid to have a point of view, even like a political point of view, especially if they're trying to reach, a younger demographic. And, I don't think anything about that's going to change. I think that's a trend that's here to stay, and it's going to only build, and it's a really good thing, because I think you'll see a lot more interesting things being told from brands across all sorts of categories. So.
Yeah, one thing I was really happy to hear that REI is doing, and other companies are doing this now. We've now mandated that 50% of the directors behind the camera have to be women on REI's films, and 70% of the subjects in front of the camera have to be women's stories. And we're greater than 20% diversity across the board, and growing as well. And I think what I'm really excited about is that not just them, but other brands are starting to do this and move in this direction. And Hollywood is so slow to do so, but the brands are actually doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're doing it because there's a business result attached to it as well. It's not like pandering, like at least in a lot of the case studies that I've read or things, and I think it's great. So.
Yeah. So we want to open up to questions. I don't know if there's microphones, or if you just want to raise your hands and yell. I'll take this one in the front and then back, and then you to start. So the question, for those of you who didn't hear, it was about distribution, where that fits in on this, and then also festivals. Either one, you want to start, and I'll add to that.
I think, especially depending on level investment, distribution's, part of it, but I think brands are finding new ways to get value out of all sorts of content, and it's really all about creating that direct connection to the audience and continuing the conversation and having them opt in so they can be, marketed to later, whether it's email or things like that. So, certainly distribution is, part of the equation, and I think it comes down to scoping it out as early as you can. Like, what are your expectations? Like, if you want to do a 90-minute documentary and you have a $100,000 budget, you're not going to make one, but it's not going to be a Netflix original or something along those lines. Like setting realistic expectations on both sides of the table. And then as far as the festivals, I think, it really is very dependent on what festival you're talking to. Like, some of the European ones are like Sundance is somewhat allergic to brand involvement, but I think as more and more brand dollars are coming into the space, it's just becoming a reality of the business, if you will, and they just want the best films to screen and premiere at their festival. I don't know, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I've distributed films at probably every film festival in the world and never had them turned down. I think if it's good content, if it's not overly branded and lots of product placement and doesn't seem genuine, they definitely will turn it down, and they have their standards. But we've played brand films at Sundance, at Tribeca, Telluride, Cannes, Berlin. Wow. So you can get them in there if it's a good piece. And on the distribution side, I think, if you can't do it. It's just difficult for a brand to get on board because they want to know it's going to get seen. So a lot of times when I talk to students in some classes I teach about this, I talk about try to go to a platform first and get a deal for something. So it doesn't have to be a Netflix either.
Yeah, I think the platforms like Netflix, Amazon, they're eventually going to see it as a way to offset their acquisition costs. So if it would cost us, you know, 1.1 million to acquire Film X, if we can do it with a brand and get it for 500, and it's, you know, not going to turn off the audience or cause churn, they're obviously going to start to take on a lot more of those.
Yeah, one woman I know with the production, she was pitching brands. She went to Refinery 29 first and made a deal where they were going to showcase the videos on their homepage. So then she could take Refinery 29's numbers to the brands and say, not only do we have this cool series, but it's going to live here and they get this many millions of views every day. And then the brands are like, oh, okay, this isn't going to just disappear on a YouTube channel no one watches.
And if the talent comes with a brand attached, like, you know, for example, Jerry Seinfeld has Lavazza Coffee and Comedians in Cars Drinking Coffee or whatever that show is. And so I think when they come to the table with the platforms, they carry a lot of sway.
I think there was a question back here, and there's a mic now, maybe.
Hi. So my question stems from essentially deliverables and in the sense of engagement. And when you're promising these brands, sometimes that's difficult to say, this is exactly what you're going to get. After we're going to produce this for you, it's going to be, again, quality not being the problem, really, the production not being the issue. It's really about, like, what do we get out of this from the consumer or from the person who's watching this? How do you protect yourself when you promise those things? And then what are some, if you look at that as currency, what do you think is the most difficult promise or deliverable from an engagement perspective to promise? And is that a recurring thing? Do brands often want the same type of engagement, or is that engagement that they're looking for very specific to their niche?
Okay, I think I understand the question. Are you referring to, like, qualitatively, like what are they going to get out of it, or quantitatively?
Yeah, I guess which of those do you find to be the thing that the brand is searching for or wants promised? Are they saying we want this many impressions, engagement, likes, shares? What do they value, essentially?
Can I ask you a question back? Have you produced content for a brand before?
I have, yes.
Okay, so, I mean, then you probably know that the conversation is, like, really specific depending on who the brand is. Like, brands are just, like, you know, people, right? I mean, there's so many different, you know, sort of like tastes and strategies and styles and preferences and evolutions. And one of the things that I found that's unexpected but very helpful is to have a sort of pregame before you even, like, put a deck together, even if you have an idea or a concept, like really using all of your, like, willpower to, like, not be like, oh, I have the best idea ever and I really want to pitch it to Rob, but I'm not going to, because it's like I want to hear what he's really looking for before I even craft it. Because generally speaking, almost all ideas can be, like, tucked under certain goals and objectives, but if it's like, oh, now you're on the bullseye or you're close to the bullseye because I know that he's looking for, you know, to reach a global audience or to reach a female audience or to reach people on mobile devices or whatever kind of thing, then that it can be kind of the emphasis that I put together in my pitch. Doesn't mean I'm changing my story, that, you know, I'm, like, allowing the brand to dictate what I shoot, but it's more about positioning so that you're more successful in your pitch. Does that help? And then as far as, like, the quantitative, like, deliverables, we actually have, like, an asset creation chart. I know that sounds super jargony, but it's really increasingly important because every brand, whether or not they know they need it, and if you're talking to, like, the ski brand expert at REI, I'm sure they're more expert on skiing than they are on, like, YouTube and Instagram and IGTV and all these, like, new sort of formats that are evolving. And they don't want to be experts in that stuff. They would rather just get back to the slopes, I imagine. So, you know, the idea being, if you can come in as really an educational partner and say, look, you know, you may not know that Instagram stories are going to give you, like, a 30x engagement rate, but then, you know, I've noticed on your channel, and doing your homework is really key, that, you know, you have these beautiful skiing videos, but not a lot of comments or shares are happening, and so here's how we're going to address that with this new series, and sort of, like, kind of have a forecast as to what types of objectives they may have and address them proactively.
Yeah, I think it's like just having conversations and documenting as much as you can up front. And, I think as far as like the space, like the market's becoming a bit cleaner, where you had maybe companies like Vice who were like doing like ad buy arbitrage, where they knew they could buy 1 million YouTube views and charge the client X dollars and, mark it up that way. Like a lot of those sorts of deals are going away. I think as far as like saying to a partner, all right, yeah, this is going to be a Sundance doc and it's going to be distributed on Netflix. Like, don't get into that game, because like you're just setting each other up for disappointment. But also working with them to say, all right, where are all the places where you can use this film, or pieces from this film, or pieces from this show, or pieces from this 1 minute short, or whatever it might be. Can you screen it in stores? Can you create special events? Can you do it at industry festivals? Can you use it for like at a trade show booth? All of the different ways that they can get value out of it to justify that production investment. And as Megan said, it's all very it's all bespoke. There's not one deck where you can just take out their name and it can work across 100 different pitches.
And a lot of times I've had to convince clients that they don't want to go the Netflix route, because what they wanted to know was number of views, and Netflix doesn't tell you.
Yeah.
And we can estimate, like everyone has their own formulas they make up of like how many people might be watching Netflix at any given time. But if that's what you want to know, then you want to be on a platform that's like either a transactional like iTunes or something that's measured by Nielsen, where you can actually give results.
Yeah.
And every brand's different. Like at REI, when we're doing stuff that's going to end up living on YouTube, for example, we're down to the cost per second and whether or not it's worth doing that versus an advertisement on the budget. But when it's something that's going to be a long form play that's going to go more on iTunes and theaters, we're not measuring those same deliverables. It's tailored to each project.
Yeah, and I think if it is something that's niche and the quality of the audience that it's reaching is a higher level, like it's not necessarily like a CPM conversation, but for example, on like fermented Volpe, really wanted to get in front of those people who are really passionate about fermentation. And, that was the conduit for them to connect with them. So, getting the same number of people to watch it on YouTube it's not like an even kind of scale, I guess. So it's again, engaging with the partner, saying, hey, who's important to you? And, how hard is it to reach those people? That can impact like what the solution is.
Question back here.
Sort of takes off sort of what you guys are talking about now, how everything is a channel. And I was really curious and fascinated by the Patagonia story, how they used the stores and the windows. It just like blew my mind. I just had like this light bulb moment, like everything is a channel. I'm a channel, you're a channel, the stores. And I noticed one of the bullet points, they turned down, you said turn down traditional distribution. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in that particular case, and I think this is true for a lot of brands, they can be control freaks. And often when you go to Sundance and sell your movie to the highest bidder or whoever happens to take it, the distributor has a glass of champagne with you, which they then charge you back in their expense report, and then never wants to talk to you again. And Patagonia had that experience on an earlier film that they sold to a well-known distributor who then dictated everything about the campaign. Patagonia wanted to be able to control what the poster looks like, when things are going out on what channels. We knew that our audience has an audience. That's why that Instagram campaign was really crucial, because we wanted people to share it. And we just knew that the distributor was just going to throw things up on IndieWire that no one reads. And we wanted to go to a certain consumer, and we want to be able to control every aspect of that. So increasingly, the brands I've worked with want to hire someone like me or a Brahmarama, where it's like a service deal where you pay someone to do the distribution for you, and you give them the money, but you keep all the profit and you control more of the campaign. But then sometimes your biggest goal is just reach, and you want to just be on Netflix even though they take control. And so sometimes that's a decision you have to take. But Netflix, you give them a handful of images and they choose what goes on. They don't even show your poster anymore. And so you lose a lot of control working with certain partners. We got time for one more question. There's one here, unless someone's already got the microphone back there. Sure.
When you, since the brands are paying for the project, do they own it outright, or do you, the filmmaker, have any residual ownership of the property?
That's a great question. It varies.
It varies deal to deal. Sometimes they'll actually want the filmmaker, the producer, to own it just on the distribution side. A lot of times they'll want to own it, especially if they want to do different things for like marketing types of purposes and things like that. Yeah, it just varies project to project and who's in their legal department and stuff.
And I'll also say that I know you noted earlier about the editorial rights for music and things like that. It actually impacts the budget quite substantially depending on what project it is. So in some cases, insurance-wise and just in terms of legal liability, like it's not ideal for you to own the project. In fact, it's much more ideal if they're going to inherit all that risk. So we've actually vacillated on depending and looked at it on a project-by-project basis, and sometimes it's much more advantageous for them to hire us as service providers. And then again, the sort of trust and respect is much more dictating what happens after the fact, as opposed to there's not a lot of money to be made in residuals on branded content.
But you spend a lot of time negotiating all this before you go into the project, and you should know what you want most for you and your project and how much control you want as well.
And one more thing, in the budget of the project that you're selling to the brand to pay for, you build in your profit and margin as part of the budget overall?
Yeah, you would typically try to build in the fee you think you need to get if the film was to make no more money whatsoever, so that you're covered for your overhead in the best case scenario. But a lot of times you may end up where a brand is just one funder in the project, and you may have other investors and maybe grants, and you may have a traditional waterfall where as a producer you see profits if there's more profits. I've even had projects like Patagonia, Damnation, for example. They owned that film's copyright and at the same time made a deal with the filmmakers where if it made money over, not the entire marketing budget they spent, because that's impossible to make back, but over the production budget, that the filmmakers saw money back as well. And so every deal's different, but you can structure all kinds of things. You just want to have a really good lawyer who has experience in this area, because it's very different than traditional film deals. We can't take any more questions now, but I know a few will be here afterwards if you have questions out in the hallway. I think they're about to have a reception, and I think if you offered one of them a beer, they'd give you lots of advice.
We're cheap dates.
So thanks a lot for coming out. I want to thank the Mass Expo.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
And David and the staff and volunteers, thank you